You really do have to hold it very close. Okay. Thank you, that's extremely sweet of you to say all those things, and thank you for a very generous and warm welcome. This means a lot to me because I used to come to Brighton PSC meetings 25 years ago with my mother, and though my father is Palestinian, I was cut off from that side of my family for the first however many years of my life. And so actually, I learned a lot about the politics of my own heritage, my dad's family, through the vehicle or the vector of Brighton PSC, genuinely. So I'm very grateful. The meetings were smaller back then, which is part of the story. It's good that they're bigger now. So the way I'd like to do this is I'd like to give you 4 reasons, roughly, why I think it is that we can look forward to some degree of hope, despite such an incredibly and ostensibly depressing situation for the Palestinians, and despite the most well-recorded, well-documented, live-streamed 4K genocide in human history. So despite all of those circumstances, of which we are all very aware, I think that there are 4 very good reasons why we should also be thinking about the future and about a liberated Palestine beyond the current state of affairs. I want to do that. I also want to talk a little bit about the flotilla. I was asked by Ed to do so. I was told that people would be interested in that. I'm very happy to do that. I prefer to do it in the Q&A more than just in the talk, but I'll try and weave some of that through as well. So, there are four reasons why I think things won't be as bleak as this forever, if I can put it like that. They're fairly, I'm going to try and break them down as well as I can. And by the way, I'm not here to be a hope merchant. Things are very bleak in lots of ways. And so I think it's important to be honest about that. I don't mind simple hope merchandise, but my reasons aren't necessarily all about Palestinian liberation breaking out from within. I think perhaps the time for that, in a straightforward way, has to some degree passed. But there are other reasons why we can be hopeful. And what are they? I think, first of all, I think that I'll go through the 4 briefly and then I'll run through each of them in more detail. Number 1, I think that the antagonisms within Israeli society, the contradictions in Israeli society, are so acute, are so extreme, that they will eventually cannibalize Israel, that it will consume itself from within, and I think there are signs of that happening already. So that's number 1. Number 2, I think that the American-Israeli compact, which has always been so absolutely fundamental to the survival of the State of Israel, especially since the 1967 war, but before that as well, that is very clearly unraveling in some ways that were completely unthinkable even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, particularly around the libertarian American right, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. The other 2, and this is because I don't want to disappear the Palestinians from the story altogether, I think that there is a very significant role for the Palestinians to play in the disintegration, if I can put it like that, of the current state of affairs, which is to say Israel constituted as it is an apartheid state, a genocidal state, a colonial state. That the Palestinians, particularly Palestinians in civil society, in the diaspora, have an extremely important role to play in becoming embedded in the international civil society infrastructure that has grown over the past 20, 30 years particularly, dedicated to the liberation of Palestine. So I think that Palestine, so for example, BDS, BDS is such a fundamental tool. Other economic measures, economic boycott measures, are so very fundamental, and Palestinians in the diaspora have an incredibly important role in amplifying those movements and in organising and leading those movements. But privileged allies, and no anti-colonial struggle has ever succeeded without privileged allies, by the way. Privileged allies also have such an incredibly important role to play in that. And then finally, number 4, I think that we have been seeing for a long time a shift in global power relations between states, which is to say that the United States as a global power, as a unipolar or singular global power, has been in relatively steady decline for some time. There is a kind of what's called, in some liberal quarters, a rise of the rest. And I think with this new international relations architecture, if you like, there is within that some hope of new alliance structures that isolate Israel. And I think it's really important to say that none of these 4 things will happen in isolation. All of them interact with one another. All of them are important to one another. So, BDS, for example, speeds up the process of isolating Israel, which in turn creates more antagonism, sharper antagonism inside Israeli society. I'm going to start with that one. I'm going to start with the internal contradictions of Israeli society. I think that, to go back to the beginning, Israel was obviously founded on the basis of a massive crime. The crime of the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians. And the problem with that, beyond the moral problems, is that then Israel had to maintain an occupation, and it had to maintain its state-building program in the midst of many millions, eventually, of Palestinians. Now, if you're going to found your state on the basis of dispossession and then settler colonialism, you'd better create an ideology that underpins it, an ideology that helps it along. Because people are capable of doing very bad things to each other, but I don't think fundamentally it comes naturally to a majority of people, a majority of the time, to subjugate each other in the way that Israel has subjugated the Palestinians. And so in order to justify that, just as in the Jim Crow South of the United States, or just as in apartheid South Africa, or just as in Nazi Germany, I think that's an analogy that's perfectly legitimate to make, you had to inculcate people with a sense of fear, and you had to inculcate people with a sense of superiority. And you had to do it from the moment people were born. You had to do it, you had to basically feed it to people as though it were breast milk. And that is something that happens in Israeli society in a very sophisticated way. And has happened from day dot. Now, what does that mean in point of view with contradictions? Why am I going on and on about 1948? Because I don't think it's very healthy to found a society on that. And I think in the end, the central problem, to put it slightly crudely, is that you run out of Palestinians. You run out of Arab neighbours or Iranian neighbours to have a war with. In the end, you've inculcated an entire population from birth with a sense of superiority. And the entire basis of their sense of superiority is that whatever problems you might have, however shit your life might be in some ways, at least you're not Palestinian. At least you're not Arab. At least you're Israeli. You are inherently superior as a result of that. But the problem with that is that eventually, as I say, you run out of Palestinians to subjugate. You run out of Palestinians to kill, you run out of Palestinians to imprison. And now you're left with a surplus population of Israelis who have been told from the day they were born that they're special, that the people that they live in the midst of are dangerous, that they are subhuman. And there's a lot of theory around frontiers. What's the point of the frontier? How did it function in the United States when European settlers were colonizing native land in the United States? And a lot of this theory alights on the view that one of its main functions is that you could just disperse people. You've got a social problem, disperse them, put them out onto the land, elsewhere. And then you can do that ad infinitum until you run out of land. I think that Israel's problem, one of its many problems, is that it's created an inherently very violent society, which is now reaching the limits of its land colonization, which is reaching the limits of its subjugation of the other. And I think that when you reach those limits, the violence turns in on itself. And there have always been racial and class antagonisms in Israel. Anybody who reads about it for 5 minutes knows that. Despite the propaganda of Hasbara, it's the opposite. And I saw that kind of racial chain of command, if you like, or the racial antagonism, play out very visibly, very tangibly, with my own eyes, in the short journey from the port of, actually before that, into being kidnapped on the boat that I was on, just outside of Gaza, taken to the port of Ashdod, transported from the port of Ashdod on a prison bus, and taken to Ketziot prison in the Negev desert. What do I mean by that? The soldiers, the highly trained Shayeret 13 soldiers who intercepted us on the boat were lily-white Ashkenazi Jews. We were then taken to the port and we were processed by Mizrahi Jews, and then we were taken to Ketziot prison and we were imprisoned by Druze. Druze prison guards. And very clearly we saw with our own eyes, everybody that was on the journey had the same experience as I did. You saw that racialized class system playing out very clearly in the short transfer from boat to prison. And then all hated each other. The striking thing for us was, first of all, we were always given this perception of Israel as a super slick machine, that it operates at such a high level, but it's, yes, they're, this is the perception, yes, they're evil, but they're incredibly effective, that kind of thing. Actually, it was gimcrack, it was falling apart at the seams. Every interval, every stage that I just described to you seemed to be utterly riven with internal contradiction, utterly riven with, internal dilemma, and all the people that we encountered hated each other. They very visibly hated each other. We spent a long time in the prison. We had the prison guards arguing with each other when there were no prisoners around, because it was a big echoing place and you could hear people from miles away. Now, does that mean Israel's about to collapse? No. But I think it's one example of how, when we look at Israel, understandably, we think, the term that people use is Judeo-supremacism. And I'm fine with that, but what I think that conceals is that it's actually European Ashkenazi supremacism. And underneath that, you have people from Jewish backgrounds who have been assimilated into the state of Israel at a lower class, at a lower stratum, basically. And that's a very real antagonism in Israeli society. Mordechai Vanunu, the guy who blew the whistle on Israel's secret nuclear program in 1986, sold his story to the Sunday Times. revealed to the world that Israel had been lying about its nuclear weapons program. He was motivated by a sense of injustice toward the Palestinians. He was motivated by a sense of commitment to the truth because he knew that he could see with his own eyes. He was a nuclear technician working in the Novara nuclear facility. He could see that Israel was lying to the world. He knew it. But he was also motivated because his family was Sephardi Jews who had come to Israel and experienced masses of racism at the hands of Ashkenazi Jews in Israel who felt emboldened to do so because they had been told that because they were European, they were superior. Beyond that, I think that, and this is where BDS comes in, and this is where isolating the state of Israel from various economic, civil society and otherwise measures is so important. Beyond that, the state of Israel is, I think, economically, it's being propped up by a tech boom. But when the genocide, or let's say the most recent, the Gaza genocide, first started, Israel's economy was briefly in freefall. It was doing very badly indeed, and it was only a massive injection of two things: tech investment and American aid that actually turned it around. And I think a lot of its growth since then has been contingent on the tech bubble. None of us knows when it's going to burst or what will happen. But I think it will very significantly impact the Israeli economy when it does. And I think that that will sharpen those antagonisms. I think that that then dovetails with what I was saying about isolating Israel economically. The reason I think that BDS has got such an important role to play is because I think militarily we've lost this battle. At this point in time anyway, we've lost this battle. You know, Palestinian armed resistance in the 1960s and 70s created genuine damage and had a genuine chance of bringing people to the table and shifting the dialogue. That, I think, the military asymmetries that have been amassed since then means quite simply that there is at the moment no military solution to this. There are only the economic measures that have begun with so much promise for BDS, but I think we need to, I think that the economic strangulation, I'm going to put it as bluntly as possible, the economic strangulation and isolation of Israel is the only way to actually enforce meaningful change and speed up those internal antagonisms and contradictions within Israeli society. The next thing is the isolation of, the collapse of the American-Israeli compact. Now, that's not going to happen overnight, and it's not, give me 1 second. That's not going to happen overnight, and it's clearly something that there's going to be enormous vested interest pushed back against. They're not going to go gently into the good night. The AIPAC, they're going to absolutely go to war with people like Tucker Carlson, who there's lots of debate about whether Tucker Carlson is an ally or an enemy. I don't want to get into all of that. My basic view is that there is an Achilles heel here, a very clear Achilles heel, which is the American-Israeli relationship. And the reason AIPAC goes into overdrive, whenever that's threatened, is because they understand that as soon as that relationship is gone, it's over. It's over. And so much investment is placed into ensuring that it's not over. And I don't even need to go into loads of detail. We all know in this room, probably, from watching the interviews of, the kind of news that filters through onto social media, you don't even need to watch Tucker Carlson to know that there is a massive backlash on the American right against Israel at the moment. Some of it is probably motivated, some of it probably is motivated by anti-Semitism. Candace Owens, I'm sorry, you know. At the same time, if we're to take a long-term strategic view, and we're to be as hard-headed and realist about this, the collapse of the libertarian right, so-called, and Israel's special relationship is absolutely enormous for the Palestinians. Because without that, over the past 60 years, since June 1967, particularly in the Six Day War, it would have not happened the way it has. It's only because of, and I know this preaching to the choir, cliche, all the rest of it, but it's only because of America's support that Israel's been able to get away with indulging its lust for genocide in the way that it has. And so when that phrase, as it very clearly is now, it's done. I remember very recently, Gavin Newsom, who is going to possibly be the Democrat candidate at the 2028 American election, he was saying, it's apartheid, it's apartheid. You know, Israel's practicing apartheid on the Palestinians. And then 2 days later, he was saying it's not apartheid, I made a mistake. Yeah. Guy obviously wavers with the wind. But if we can see past his total and utter disingenuity, or disingenuousness, I think what you see is that there's a very interesting realignment in American politics, which is that lying bastards used to always say that they supported Israel more than they do. Now lying bastards are wondering whether they should be saying they support Palestine more than they do. Cynical to say that, strategic, realist, very effing important. And that's where the new centre of gravity is shifting to, in my opinion, in American politics. Might not happen overnight. When you see that 60% of young people, one poll, it was a Gallup poll, I think. 60% of young people, when I say young people, I can't remember the exact cutoff, but I think it was 25 and under, support Hamas. 60%, and I'm not passing any, it's no value judgment of this at all, I'm just stating a fact. A poll stated that 60% of Americans under the age of 25 support Hamas. You know something has really shifted. The dam was busted. And there are serious, serious questions for Israel on that front. You know, any hope of surviving long term, when your closest ally is producing polls like that, you're fucked, sorry. You're fucked. And then finally, how long have I been talking?
I don't know, I'm listening.
How long? Okay.
You're fine.
Alright, I'll talk for another few minutes and then we can have a Q&A. It's nice to have a general discussion. Yeah, I think that the final is probably the final of the four that I'm proposing, four categories of possible sources of hope. Hope is maybe the wrong word, but you know what I mean. It's probably the weakest, which is that there's a kind of shift in the global balance of power between states, and that the US power relative to other states is ebbing, and that states like China and the BRICS, as they call them, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa and others, that they're rising. And with their rise, there will be new alliance structures. People in the global south don't like what's been done to Palestine. More, even less than people in the global north, because people in the global north don't like what's been done to Palestine anymore, really. If you look at polling data today. But even more so in the global south. And so there is, I think, something to be said for the rise of the rest. I hate to use the term that CNN coined, but to illustrate the point, I think that though it's the least important, I think it's the least important because I think capitalism does terrible things to countries and it does terrible things to their minds. And I think that, you can have states that become powerful that were previously poor, that then completely adopt capitalist principles and to hell with the Palestinians in that context. So I'm not saying that's possible. So that's why I say it's the least probable, but I think it's contingent on the others. If you have Israel tearing itself to pieces internally, building a kind of hanging on the Babylon that can't be sustained, founded on the hatred of the Palestinians, founded on the dispossession of the Palestinians, and you have the American libertarian right relationship collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, which is America sending it money all the time to save its favourite colony. And you have international civil society, all of us, organising as often as possible, in as many spaces as possible, and strangulating the economy. It's a peaceful way of destroying a state, by the way, is strangulating its economy. I'm advocating for a peaceful method. But if you're strangulating the economy, and those three things are happening in tandem, and you have the rise of these new states that were formerly at the sharp end of the international capitalist system, and their civil societies are stridently, residually pro-Palestinian, then actually I think you put all those things together and there is serious cause for hope. But we're going to have to batten down the hatches for a few years, a good few years. And this is something that's easier for us to do than it is for Palestinians to do. Because I think actually, I've heard Milan Pape say this, and he's right. None of us knows what the future holds. But one thing that history shows us is that when states are collapsing, they become even more violent than they've been. So we need to be vigilant for that. I don't think it's any time for us to feel powerless. Because Israel will probably get more violent. Sorry, that's a depressing note to end on. But it probably will get more violent. The good news, if we can glean good news from all, if we can take good news from that, is that it's becoming more violent because it knows it's collapsing. I don't know if that's a positive note to end on or not, but in any case, it's the end.